Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about lipids and we'll be going over different terms to know, the different types of lipids that you should know, as well as the general structure and composition of lipid molecules. So we're going to start by highlighting really what lipids are, is that they are molecules that have a really high nonpolar to polar ratio. And so if you look over here, these are some examples of lipids that are important to know, and we'll be going into a little bit more detail about these in later slides. But you'll notice that they have lots of hydrocarbons, like huge chains of hydrocarbons. There's just a lot of hydrocarbons connected together, except for the occasional oxygens and other polar molecules. And so this high nonpolarity makes them something that's called hydrophobic, which basically means that they are not soluble in water. And being hydrophobic is the opposite of being hydrophilic. So I'm sure you have heard these terms before, but phobic is like, fear of water, meaning that lipids don't dissolve in water, versus being hydrophilic is something that is polar usually and can dissolve in water. And so similarly, lipids are lipophilic, meaning that they are soluble in nonpolar solvents. So they love lipids, which is what this philic part here means. And so these are interchangeable terms, hydrophobic and lipophilic, as well as hydrophilic and lipophobic. These are also kind of basically representing the same meanings. So just know that these can kind of be used interchangeably, and just make sure you know the difference between all of them. So we're going to go over the first type, which is called a fatty acid, and these are kind of like the biological precursors. They are the foundation for a lot of bigger lipid molecules, and they're composed of a carboxylic acid with a long unbranched chain. So let's take a look at lauric acid here. We have that carboxylic acid as well as that chain of hydrocarbons, and usually there's an even number of them, not always, but here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, which is an even number. And here we have linoleic acid, which again we have that carboxylic acid structure as well as that hydrocarbon chain. And what you'll notice about these two types of fatty acids is that one contains double bonds and one does not. So when you have a molecule that has no carbon-carbon double bonds, it's considered saturated. And when you have something that does have double bonds, it's considered unsaturated. And usually in an unsaturated molecule, you'll see that these double bonds kind of cause kinks in the structure of the molecule, so it kind of like bends over here, kind of makes it hard for it to be straight. And that's a good way to kind of remember what unsaturated molecules can look like. And you don't really need to understand the mechanism of how this forms at this level, but it's important in terms of understanding the structure of the molecule. The second type is a wax, and these are composed of fatty acids. Again, these are biological precursors for a lot of these other lipids, and a long hydrocarbon chain with an alcohol. So usually I look for an ester in waxes. So here's an example of a wax. Here we have the ester, and the way this molecule forms is it gets this fatty acid here, this is oleic acid, combining with this long hydrocarbon chain where that alcohol is. And so these two combine together and they form this ester, which forms this wax here. And waxes are really important for, protecting you from water, which is why we have things like earwax and such in our bodies. And just to reiterate, a lot of these molecules, it's not really necessary at this point to know the mechanisms. That's for higher level organic chemistry that you may or may not be taking. But it's important to understand what these structures of these molecules look like and what their functions are. So those are the two major things that we're going to focus on during the video today. So next we have triacyl glycerols, and these are composed of 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. So this tri here kind of refers to those three fatty acids there. And a glycerol is indicated by this structure here. So when you react these together, you kind of get this reaction where you get water to be released, And now you form this, this ester here. And the function of a triacylglycerol is energy storage. And what's really cool about triacylglycerols is that they are important in soaps particularly. So if you imagine that you had a molecule that was contained the C, double bond to an O, O minus, along with this hydrocarbon chain here, kind of connecting down there. These parts of a triacylglycerol can form something called a micelle, which is like kind of a ball, in my opinion, of different hydrocarbon tails being connected together, kind of orienting themselves in this circular formation. And here, this ball corresponds to this part, this shaded figure, and then this part corresponds to these like squiggly line tails here. And so usually this part is considered polar, so it kind of orients itself out into the aqueous environment, whereas the internal part is nonpolar, as indicated by the long hydrocarbon chain. So this part's the polar head, this is the nonpolar tail, and here you usually have like dirt or something that's like nonpolar being trapped and surrounded by these molecules, and that's kind of how soap works. Components kind of circle around these dirt particles and kind of trap it. So that's the basis for how a micelle soap works. The next type you should know is called a phospholipid. These are composed of a phosphatic group with 2 fatty acids, an ester, and a glycerol. So let's look at this phospholipid here and try to identify the different components. Here we have our fatty acid. Here's our second fatty acid. We have our phosphate group here. Here is our glycerol in the black text. And we have our ester. So these are the different components of a phospholipid. They're pretty easy to recognize when you look for that phosphate group. This component over here can vary depending on the type of phospholipid that you have. And phospholipids are important because, as you may have learned in an earlier biology class, they form our cell membranes. The next type is a prostaglandin, and these are composed of 5-member rings with 2 hydrocarbon chains, as well as these carboxylic acid components. And they're often unsaturated, so you have double bonds in some of the hydrocarbon chains. And what's important about prostaglandins is that they are functioning as chemical messengers, so they're important in things like platelet aggregation and regulating the inflammatory response. And so we have these in our bodies for those purposes, and it's good to recognize them by their 5-member ring as well as these 2 hydrocarbon chains connected to the 5-member ring. The next type is a steroid, which I'm sure you know about, things like testosterone, estrogen, and these are composed of 4 fused rings, so these are really, really unique structures, easy to recognize if you were ever presented with them. And this is aldosterone here I have shown, which is important in the sodium-potassium regulation of our body. And so steroids are important in regulating bodily processes. They're pretty, they have a very wide range of functions, similar to prostaglandins. So they can do a variety of things, of course, such as managing our hormones and things like that. So just make sure you recognize these 4 fused rings here. The last type we should know is a fat-soluble vitamin. And this is, for me, in terms of the classes, it's just kind of easy to recognize in the sense that it doesn't really fall into any of the other categories of lipids that we talked about earlier. So you usually look for things like rings in these hydrocarbon chains, but if it doesn't really meet the criteria of the other ones, it's likely to be a fat-soluble vitamin. And these are very nonpolar, which is why they're fat-soluble. So you have this hydrocarbon chain. Functions can vary. Here I have vitamin E, but they can do a lot of different things, from like vision to oxidative damage and such. So there's 4 different types of fat-soluble vitamins: vitamin D, A, K, and E. So those are the 4 types that are good to know. And that basically summarizes the lipids